Joining Bruce Spence and I is Paul Barnsley, executive producer of APTN Investigates. Ryerson Review of Journalism calls him, quote, one of Canada's best Indigenous affairs investigative reporters. He won the Journalists for Human Rights Annual Lifetime Achievement Award back in 2016 for his work in Indian country. And before APTN, Paul was the national editor and senior reporter at Windspeaker. That was back in the mid-90s. And before that, he was a reporter at Six Nations. Paul, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Melissa.
Well, you've been around for a long time. How many AFNs have you covered? How many national chiefs have circled through in your career?
I should have done the math on that. Let me think. I wrote about the national chief election in 1994. So 94, 97, 2000, a bunch.
A bunch.
Ovid Mercury won in 94. And then the first one I attended was in 97 in Vancouver, and that's when Phil Fontaine upset, some would say, Ovid Mercury, his fellow Manitoban. And that was the first of 3 terms as national chief that Phil served. He was interrupted after his first term by Matthew Kunkam, a James Bay Cree candidate. And Matthew served 1 term, and then Phil had 2 more. Since then, we've had Sean Atleo and Perry Bellegarde. I think I've got them all. Yeah, I have got them all.
You know, there was never any shortage of fireworks at these things either. Hey, I mean, it's kind of a spectacle that Indigenous journalists look forward to going and getting to cover. I would ask Bruce, and then I'm going to ask Paul as well. What's changed the most, I guess? Just, you know, broad strokes of AFN. Either you could call it an evolution of AFN, maybe others would call it a devolution of AFN. What kind of stands out for you?
You ask tough questions, Melissa. I can't see anything really changing much at the AFN level. If anything, there would be able to get something done, like an apology from the Harper government for residential schools, and I understand now there's been a significant funding increase.
Like to the record amount of funding that they're getting now, right?
Going to the organization in the last budget. But in terms of seeing what's out on the street, not much has changed, and in fact I would put it out there that things have actually gotten worse for the common Indigenous treaty status. Your average Joe and Jane on the streets are no better off than they were a few years ago.
Decades ago. Paul, is there anything that, you know, in the years that you've been covering, you know, 3 decades, is there any interesting growth of AFN that just kind of stands out from you from a reporter's perspective?
Growth is an interesting word. It's funny, back when Phil Fontaine was national chief, a young researcher named Russ Dybo wrote a paper noting that national chiefs that are more amenable to the federal government agenda tend to see their funding go up rather dramatically. And then when Matthew Kunkam said some things that outraged the federal government, his funding went down, and that has continued. You hear the term off and on of the super band office, and the idea being that AFN seeks out a lot of funding and gets it and creates a lot of jobs, and hopefully some of those jobs produce something of lasting good, although I couldn't testify under oath that has happened all that often. The pendulum swings back and forth. And right now, I think Perry Bellegarde is rivaling Phil Fontaine for the amount of money they're bringing into the organization. The big fight back in the late 90s and the early aughts, if that's the word, was over the First Nation Governance Act, and that did change the organization a bit, because suddenly now you had BC chiefs more or less, well, not unified, because the interior chiefs and the coastal chiefs always have a different look at things. But there was enough of the First Nation summit chiefs supporting the government's agenda. They weren't overly concerned with treaty issues, because when the treaty commissioners were crossing Canada back in the 1800s, they came up against the Rocky Mountains and they took a look up and went, nah, let's go home. So there are no treaties in BC.
Yeah.
So that's always been a split in the country. Ontario's the second largest bloc, so it's always been a BC-Ontario split. And it's always been a treaty, more, well, the word's been used, modern institutions. I guess you could say more Eurocentric institutions. And that's been the fight ever since the Governance Act. I'd say it's still going on. I don't follow the AFN as closely as I did, obviously, when I was covering them full time. But that's really the only significant change I've noticed. It's still very much, the case can be made that it's a lobby group for chiefs, and the grassroots people's issues are not a huge part of the mix, although the chiefs would argue differently and say they represent their people.
You know, it would be interesting.
But I know we get emails and phone calls and letters every day.
That connection between that connection between cabinet and the AFN, national chief, and a couple of the higher ranking cronies, always something that's under the radar, but it's always there.
Yeah.
You mentioned the First Nations Governance Act, and what I recall from that is empty chairs in every meeting room. Fast forward to the United Nations Declaration, which is being touted by Bellegarde, but nobody else seems to like it in the country. What's that connection there? What goes on at the cabinet table with the likes of Michael Wernick at the Privy Council and the big chiefs with their big giant headdresses? What happens behind there where they plan this stuff out? I think there's always been a connection there somehow, but how big a connection, I don't know. I've never been behind those doors.
Paul, do you know?
It's they let me in there, and I don't know. That's one of the big problems with the AFN. If they don't want you to know, you're not going to find out. You can guess, you can get some stuff leaked, but the stuff that's leaked is generally at least a little bit suspect. You can only guess, and it does seem, on looking at long-range patterns, that the federal government really needs somebody to make a deal with, and they've decided the AFN ticks all their boxes. And the AFN it's not a rights-holding organization. That's the nations that hold the rights. It's not a government, although the national chief gets treated like the First Nation prime minister. But cabinet needs somebody to make a deal with as they try to solve, quote unquote, their Indian problem.
Exactly.
And the AFN plays that role, yeah. And I'm not impugning the character of any of the leaders. It's a tightrope to walk it. And all of them have made very positive contributions to the rights picture. But man, there's a certain political reality that stalks the hallways of power. It's a complicated job. I'm not about to judge anybody for how they do it. Did I answer your question, Melissa?
You did, and I actually had a follow-up question to that, but we have a caller right now, so I will make a mental note to revisit it. We have Bruce on the line. Bruce 2.0 is joining us on the phone.
Hello.
Hey, what did you want to add to the conversation?
Well, I understand the AFN is important, and I understand they're funded by the federal government. I don't know their budget, but I'd like to know what their mandate is. I try and search information on the internet about them, but nothing is available. Just wondering why or how can we receive information about them?
Bruce, I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, that alone, the question alone speaks volumes. I mean, if people are wondering, what's the AFN do? How much money do they get? What is the money spent on? And you have trouble figuring that out. I mean, AFN's not doing well in the comms department, I guess.
Bruce asks a very interesting question, and
comes with the name, right?
Yes. If you go to afn.ca, there is some links there that will tell you what their mandate is, what the AFN thinks their mandate is. It sets out their charter, and I can't quote it in detail like Paul does, but a lot of that stuff is in there. As for the budget that they've got, couldn't tell you.
Well, I know that they've secured, it's double-digit billions of dollars, right?
$27 billion this time. And I think back in the day, it was 20. Couldn't tell you.
Paul, where does it go?
It goes to a variety of people who are hired to design and deliver programs. There's controversy over that too. That's the super band office thing again.
I would hope there would be.
Because all the chiefs would rather have the money go right to them, but it goes to Ottawa instead. And that's one of the controversies, no doubt about that. But the national chief can get a lot of his power from being able to, dangle the possibility of employment in really good paying jobs to people who support him or her, although there's never been a her.
Yeah.
And that's all part of the process. So it's a good thing from the national chief's perspective to get more and more funding. They can certainly do things that benefit themselves when the numbers go up.
This is kind of one of the things that infuriates me in all of this is you look at how much money is spent in the Indian Affairs Department and versus, $1. Paul, you and I have had a gazillion conversations about this, how $1 from there, if you were to follow that dollar, how many pennies get to the actual people on the ground, a First Nations person. It would be out of that dollar pennies. And I guess the same people could have the exact same criticism about the AFN. There's $27 billion and how, we still have abject poverty. We have a whole bunch of issues that have never been solved despite all of this money being thrown at it. I wanted to go to a clip here. We have two previous national candidates chiefs. We're going to watch these clips and then we'll come back and chew on what they had to say.
Well, I have lots of support from the people, the grassroots. I have some support from the chiefs. I don't know if I have the 60% needed to win. That's what I have to try and convince the majority of the chiefs here, that they need to choose between Ottawa or the people. I represent the people and the land in my approach. The rest of them are really, like I said, status quo.
AFN is missing spiritual leadership, and that's what our elders say, because when you're not grounded in your language and you're not attached to the land, and when you're not grounded in who you are as a person, then your leadership, your vision is missing, and we don't have a clear, powerful vision to lead us forward like our ancestors of old did, that we could look back to.
Both Russ and Catherine summarize what we hear a lot from a lot of different people. Paul, I'll ask you, if you could whisper in the ear of any potential national candidate chiefs thinking about running in this next election, what advice would you have for them?
Well, let's assume that the ultimate goal is to win the election. I could offer advice on all sorts of other things, but to win the election, you have to bring together the now warring parties is not a delicate term, but the differing parties, the treaties versus not the treaties. And I have to pay many respects to Phil Fontaine. I thought he did that masterfully. That's why he got 3 terms. He found a way to somehow get everybody pointed in the same direction, and it's no easy thing to do, and it shouldn't be an easy thing to do. Every individual nation or First Nation obviously is its own entity with its own dreams and aspirations. But as a national organization, you have to be a master politician to get the organization to any kind of consensus at any time. And in my time, the best at that was Phil Fontaine. He did it. like, it just used to just shock me how effective he was at these assemblies, because there's always so much political intrigue going on behind the scenes. The place to be, you cover these chiefs' assemblies, is out in the corridors or in the back room somewhere.
I remember you saying that.
A lot of the stuff that happens on the floor, I know for a fact. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I know there were some chiefs who were or some elders who were told, get out there and start talking. We got to get into a back room somewhere and bash out a deal, and you just keep talking until we come back. And that in itself is an art form, believe me.
Well, Paul, we thank you for taking the time to chew the fat with us.
It's a fascinating thing to cover.